Hello, everyone. I am Tamar Hoffnung, and I welcome you all to our virtual book talk on the book Collective Equality, Democracy and Human Rights in Ethno-National Conflicts. This event is brought to you today by the UCLA YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, and it is co-sponsored by the UCLA International Institute as part of its Democracy, Freedom, Truth, Critical Conversations from Diverse Global Perspectives initiatives, and the UCLA Department of Sociology, as well as the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies. This talk also follows my course in sociology, which discusses governing the mosaic, minority politics, Israel in a comparative perspective. And I am honored to introduce to you Dr. Limor Yehuda. Dr. Limor Yehuda is a legal scholar that studies ethno-national conflicts and transitions to peace. She's a senior research fellow and director of the partnership-based peace project at Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, and as well as a lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. This is a Collective Equality, Democracy and Human Rights in Ethno-National Conflicts is her first book published by Cambridge University Press. Limor has a very, very rich career in these topics. And on top of what she is currently doing as a senior research fellow, she has also worked as a founder of the Israeli-Palestinian movement, A Land for All. She previously clerked for President Aharon Barak at Israel's Supreme Court and was a practicing human rights lawyer and the director of the Human Rights in the Occupied Territory discussions and at the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, also known as ACRI. I am looking forward to discussing with Limor her book, which could offer us some interesting insights into current events and the current conflicts, and perhaps also start discussing some ways of thinking about it. Limor has also recently published a few commentaries and opinion pieces in the New York Times discussing some solutions or some paths forward. So I'm very excited to start the talk.
Thank you very much, Tamar. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this event. I will start with a personal note and say that what motivated me to do the research that is based, that the book is based on, is a need, my need, I think, not only mine, to seek new answers to the reality here in Israel-Palestine of endless conflict and occupation, and because of the dead end in which the peace process between Israel and Palestine has reached long ago. And recent events and the devastating human tragedy that continues to unfold before our eyes since the Hamas massacre on October 7th and the subsequent Israeli attack exceeds all my fears. And in my presentation today, I will not engage with relating to the ongoing situation in Gaza, but rather with a questions, and analysis that takes a longer term perspective, and that asks how this conflict, violent conflict that already is going on for 100 years, can be transformed. The book draws on research on multiple fields. As you said, I'm a legal scholar, but the book is based on in literature in many other fields, empirical and theoretical accounts, as well as a comparative analysis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to other conflicts and peace processes, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which I will talk about today, Northern Ireland, and Cyprus. And based on renewed understandings of violent conflicts, this is my first step that I'm doing in the book. The book opens a long set of questions among them, and maybe I'll share here my screen. I have a presentation. So the book opens a long list of questions which I will not be able to deal with all of them today, so only sample few. Among them, what are the advantages and limitations of partition as a solution to violent conflicts? And I think this is a question that is relevant these days as the new state solution, as a new state solution to the conflict is again on the international agenda. What are the limitations of liberal democracy in such places? I will skip that question for today because of time concerns, but if anybody is interested, I can talk more about that. Why has the use of power sharing models, consociational democracy, became a central tool of peacemaking? What are the primary objections, political and legal, raised against these models? What is the legal and theoretical problem with these models? What is collective equality? So based on these renewed understanding and problems, I will introduce collective equality, which is the central idea of the book. What is theoretical and legal innovations it offers? What are the theoretical and legal innovations it offers? Is it a naive thinking or actually a pragmatic ideal, a realistic ideal? If and how it aligns with a liberal conception of justice, with existing international law, and can it inform more sustainable peace processes, more useful, more pragmatic and sustainable? Okay, so those are the questions, and I will deal only with part of them, and I start with Bosnia. And the Bosnian War, well, actually I start with the beginning of the end. And this is a picture from the signing of the Dayton Peace Agreement in December in 95. It was a dramatic peace agreement reached after 3.5 years of war. The sides to the war were three ethno-national groups: Bosniak Muslims, which were around half of the population, a little less than half of the population of Bosnia, Bosnian Serbs, Christian Orthodox, which are around a third of the population, and Bosnian Croats, around 18% of the population estimated. Bosnia is was part of Yugoslavia, and it was at the time of the disintegration process of Yugoslavia that the Bosnian Muslims pursued independence for Bosnia, but the Bosnian Serbs objected that. What happened is that following the Bosnia War followed the Bosnian Declaration of Independence and the adoption of liberal democracy as the state's political structure. Why is it? Why is it that these two decisions brought about this kind of horrific war? So we need to look at what implications it had for the power structure within Bosnia. And if before the Serbs were one of the peoples of Yugoslavia that major decisions could not be taken without their consent, suddenly in the new polity, they become a minority, not only a demographic minority, but also a political minority. A political minority that such cardinal decisions as independence can be taken without their consent. And that political decision brought about the war with horrific, this is some of the horrific human tolls of that war. More than 100,000 people that are killed, millions of refugees and internally displaced, systematic rape as a strategy of war, and a case of genocide that had been recognized by international courts as such. Again, so following that war, and despite a lot of cynicism and disbelief that peace can be obtained in such a situation, believing that these places are full of hatred and fear that cannot be overcome, a peace agreement is being signed, and not only being signed, but actually maintains without returning to war. One thing that it was written here, but I forgot to mention, the logic of the war was ethnic separation, because the idea was, because no longer cooperation between people is possible, what we need to achieve is homogenic territories. And therefore, the policy of the war was ethnic cleansing. At the end of the war, part of the Dayton Peace Agreement, they had two major components to the. So first of all, the Dayton Peace Agreement includes the Dayton Constitution. The new Constitution of Bosnia is a central element of this peace process, of this peace agreement. And it includes two parts, or more than that, but I am making it simple. So two central parts is dividing Bosnia into two sub-entities, like using federalism as dividing the Bosnian state. And the second is power sharing at the center of power. This is the presidency of Bosnia, which includes representatives from each of the three groups. The idea, and this is established in the constitution, that there are three constituent peoples of Bosnia, which are those three ethnic groups, that they are comprising the most of the population of Bosnia, but as we will see, not all of it. Okay, so I said that most of the analysts were pessimistic, and nevertheless, the piece holds. So in a way, all sounds good, right? What's the problem? So there is some problem, and here are two gentlemen. I met the one on the left. His name is Pinci. He is the head of the Jewish community in Sarajevo, or it was at the time. And both of them are citizens of Bosnia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, but not included in the three ethno-national groups that are the central parts of the constitution. So they petitioned to the European Court of Human Rights in 2006. And in 2009, their argument before the court is that these constitutional arrangements that are based on affiliation, ethnic affiliation of people, ethno-national affiliation, is illegal and contradicts their right to equality and non-discrimination. Okay, violates their right to equality and non-discrimination. And in 2009, the court accepts their petition and declares that the contested constitutional arrangements, and specifically the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the upper legislature, which is called the House of People, which also goes along those ethno-national lines, are discriminatory. Because those arrangements use distinctions based on ethnic grounds, and the court goes into saying or classifying them as racial discrimination. And here is a quote. We don't need to go over it all, but in a way, what we can see that the court says what seems to us a very reasonable judgment, very clear, that no difference in treatment, which is based exclusively on a person's ethnic origin, or is capable of being objectively justified. So this seems to be like an established legal reasoning. And the court does not find an objective and reasonable justification for those arrangements at the time that the ruling is being handed down, more than a decade after the peace had been signed. The problem that is being raised by such a decision, by this decision, is that we are viewing now the Dayton Constitution, the Bosnian Constitution, as is not only illegal and is violating the European Convention for Human Rights, but also as non-legitimate. In a way, it threatening the legitimacy of this kind of political and constitutional arrangement, and this is a problem. Okay, so what we see in the literature, in transitional justice literature, it's often been portrayed as a peace versus justice dilemma, right? What do we prefer? Do we prefer peace? And in this judgment, we have a very strong and passionate dissenting opinion by a minority judge that says, well, you are sowing equality or justice, and you will come up with a massacre. So he's like threatening, you're assuming that Bosnia is peaceful already, but this is not really the case, and you cannot know what you're leading to. So in a way, we are framing that, we see that as a peace versus justice. We need to choose. Do we choose peace or do we choose justice? We cannot have them both, right? Well, not really. It depends on how we understand justice. This is really crucial. How do we understand justice? Is it that justice is only individual equality, or maybe in some situations we need to understand it in another way? And this is what this book is offering, a new perspective that is intended to understand specifically situations of places like this, like Bosnia, like Israel-Palestine, like Cyprus, like Northern Ireland, and many other places around the world that are regarded as deeply divided places, places of ethno-national conflicts, of violent conflicts. And this is the new perspective that I offer, collective equality. And I base this, and I think in order to understand why we need a new perspective, we must understand those conflicts. We must understand what are the background, what are the reasons, what are the root causes of such conflicts. And what I find is that many of our common beliefs about those situations are misguided, are not accurate, and what we can learn from contemporary research can shed new lights on that. So first of all, I will say that I choose this frame of ethno-national conflict also to analyze the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not because it's the only frame that is relevant, but I find it as the most useful one, and I hope I will convince you today why it's useful. So this is a chart that shows how the prevalency of ethnic and nationalist wars these days. We see how it goes up at the end of the 20th century, and it remains high to these days. Ethno-national conflicts are situations in which two or more groups pursue incompatible goals to self-determination, where at least one of the parties interprets the conflict, its causes and potential solutions along an ethnic divide. So we have conflict among groups, at least one defines in ethnic terms and its goals in self-determination. I will move over this. So now it's the question of, okay, we see them all around, we understand them, we know them. Usually, or at least in the past, I think not only in the past, many believe that ethnic diversity is detrimental. That if you have ethnic diversity, then you will not be able to have a unified state. This is threatening. But as we can see, I marked it over. It means this is not the reason that the literature and the empirical research finds. Ethnic diversity is not detrimental. Okay. With regard to the Balkan Wars in particularly, the assumption was that we are talking about ancient hatreds, that those hatreds are going for 100 years and hundreds of years, and that we cannot do anything about it. But actually, what the contemporary research shows that ethno-national conflicts are about power, political power, framed as who owns the state. We are struggling over state powers. And what we see is
compatibility.
Okay, between political exclusion from the central government and group-based inequalities and the outbreak of violent conflicts. Okay, so these two we can see alignment between them and the outbreak of violent conflict. So we see that actually what drives violent conflicts are not some kind of unpragmatic, logical explanations, but actually very logical and reasonable things about political power. When we're talking about horizontal inequalities between groups, we look at 3 dimensions, including socioeconomic inequalities, political inequalities, and cultural inequality. And as much as those are more extreme, it seems that the chances for violent conflicts arise. Okay, I want to say briefly 3 more additional characteristics of ethno-national conflicts. First are that they are not internal only, they are mixed. Okay, and they are not only external, they are mixed. We have both internal and external, international and internal dimensions for such conflicts. Most of the time, the borders themselves are part of the issue. They involve existential fear, not only for one of the sides, but for both, usually because the struggle is struggle for domination. So it's either us or them. It's either my group will be the dominant or the other one, and there is no other alternative. And of course, I don't want to be the loser in that struggle. Double majority, double minority syndrome means that both sides perceive themselves as be the true or the rightful owner of the state. And we have different justifications for being the rightful owner, but actually because we are in this struggle for domination, we are also feel like a threatened minority, maybe because we are the minority in the new state, or maybe because we are a regional minority. And so what we end up with is the worst behaviors of both arrogancy, hubris, and insecurity. Common conceptions. So in a way, the baseline about conflicts that I want to make is that common conceptions about them, about the root causes of them, disregard group-based injustices that are the drivers of such conflicts, the existential struggle for or against domination, and methodological nationalism, meaning that we do not see the full scope of the conflict because we see only what lies within the borders, but not beyond them. Okay, so I said that partition is one of the questions. After we understand the logic of such conflicts, we see, okay, we are talking about conflicts that pursue self-determination. What about external self-determination? Partition, meaning, okay, we have different groups here, better to have them separate self-determination. Well, the limits of partition have identified three major limitations. The first is legal, and I will not talk about it because it's not necessary with regard to Israel-Palestine, because legally in Israel-Palestine, this is allowed because we are talking about partition of mandatory Palestine. We're still in the two-state framework. We do not have a problem of legality. But the major problem is, or it could be, depends on how we view it, that the territories are not open to create new homogeneous nation states, because the territories are ethnically mixed. And in the past, it was used, or it was a policy, legitimate policy, for population transfers. That is no longer the case, and as you can see, 100 years after, it still is regarded as a catastrophe, although it was agreed population transfer. So my third point is, if people argue that although partition itself, okay, those are example ethnic maps of Northern Ireland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Cyprus, and Israel-Palestine, okay? So in all those cases, we can see that there is no line that we can put on the map that will make that all members of group A will be in one side and all the members of group B will be on the other side, but we still remain intermingled. The idea of population transfers is rejected both on moral ground, but also on legal ground. And I want now to see the Israeli case, okay? If we look at that map, right? Here are the figures. We're talking about in the West Bank, without Jerusalem, we're talking of 500,000 Israeli Jews that live beyond the lines. In Jerusalem, beyond the lines, we're talking about 200,000 and 40,000 Israelis. Israel within the Green Line, we're talking about 2 million Arabs, and many of them are identified as Palestinians. And Gaza is actually the only monoethnic territory. So bottom line with regard to limitations of partition is we need to understand that partition, when it's possible, even when it's possible legally, it's not possible to achieve by its separation, ethnic separation. And therefore, we cannot solve, okay? We cannot solve conflicts by using partition. We can use it, but only as part of the solution of those conflicts. And one other point that I want to make about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that although partition was the idea since the beginning, since the partition plan of the UN, how it is approached is very different at the time and now. At the UN partition plan, the idea was that we are talking about two states within a union, an economic union. Since the Oslo process started, the idea was an idea of separation, of ethnic separation, and with a very prominent slogan, "We are here and they are there," is something that Ehud Barak coined. As I said, I will not talk about liberal democracy at the moment, and I will talk briefly about power sharing. Power sharing, because of the limitations of partition and because of the limitations of liberal democracy in such deeply divided places, what we see is the growing use of power sharing systems of governance. And they are used both internally, like in Bosnia, as we saw, like in Northern Ireland, but not only internally, but also cross-border. What we see are cross-border cooperations to accommodate the ethno-national diversity in all the landscape. Power sharing, it looks into grand coalitions. So we are looking for representative governments. We are talking about proportional representation, cultural autonomy, and veto powers to protect vital interests of the group. Okay, so if we remember, we started with the problem of how human rights are actually not really in line with power, or power sharing seems not to be in line with human rights. And here I offer collective equality as another conception of justice in such places. As we saw, the problem and part of the root causes of conflict are inequalities and a struggle for domination. And the only way out of this struggle and the correction of the injustice is to replace the struggle for domination with a structure of equality. And to have equality, what do we mean by that? What kind of equality do I mean? So here I mark 4 criteria. First of all, the beginning is that we're talking about equal right to self-determination of peoples. Okay, I define peoples as a sizable collective holding and acting toward political self-determination. The second point is that what we are looking for is a fair system of cooperation. The fair system of cooperation among those groups will be the thing that will replace the violent conflict. The question is, how do we create fair relations, right? This is the opposite of violence. This is the opposite of domination. And mutual respect as part of those elements of equality. We're not talking about equality that comes from above. We're talking about equality that is happening within the relations, within and created as part of the relations, the new relations between the sides. And we're talking about equality as non-domination. Okay, and here I take from Iris Marion Young idea of equality as self-determination as non-domination. Just a second. Okay. Sorry. I look at 4 dimensions. I look at redistribution, at recognition, at representation, and equal footing in negotiations as elements that need to be taken into account when we are talking and pursuing equality to correct past injustices. But overall, what we are looking for is fair distribution of joint resources and the creation of non-dominant relations. And here I raise the question of if what I'm offering is naive. Okay, and I cannot see the ones that are hearing me talk now, but in most of my talks at that point, most of the audience nods in their way, yes. Okay, so I want to recall that collective equality as I formed it is actually based on practice, on the practice of peace processes, and actually on pragmatic ideas and pragmatic considerations. And what we began with is actually human rights saying, well, no, this is not the right way forward. This is not justice, right? So what I'm arguing is that what we have here are 2 conceptions of justice that needs to be balanced. It's not that collective equality is offered as an alternative to individual justice, but as supplementary when we are talking about deeply divided places in which the collective, in which people themselves define themselves in those lines, okay? In conclusion, I will do it briefly. So we need to look at those kinds of conflicts differently. We need to understand that they are intimate conflicts. It's not between a faraway colonizer that will go after the conflict will end, but actually those people that are engaged in conflict will be neighbors if and when peace will come. We cannot understand peace as something that is thin, but it needs to be based on fair relations. And theoretically, what I offer is another layer to understand our justice conception, another layer between the ethno-national groups. Normatively, I'm arguing that the current frames that we use are flawed and that collective equality is a way to amend them by taking a long-term perspective. And as I said, we reevaluate justice as 2 conceptions of justice. And if we use that collective equality to reread self-determination under international law, we will find that it can be more supportive of peace. And we will not need to choose between peace and justice, but we can pursue both of them. And okay, I know that I'm in a rush of time, so I will touch briefly on the question of how all this relates to Israel-Palestine. So maybe I start with basic facts that between the river and the sea, well, this is the land that is called by some Eretz Israel and by others Palestine, live 15 million people. And around half of them are Israeli Jews like myself, and another half Palestinian Arabs. And if there is one thing that we agree on, is that we are not members of the same people. And unlike the general view, this is not only an interstate, international conflict, but rather a mixed one. And I think the numbers that I showed you is that we are intermingled within the entire territory. And this is an intimate conflict in which the two sides are intermixed and we live side by side, okay? And we are found at the moment in a struggle for domination. Israel to maintain its domination, Palestinians to achieve it, to reverse, okay? The aim is reversal, and in both ways, in both sides do not see that there is any other option, but this is the struggle. And none of the people is expected to magically disappear. They need to find a way to live together, or at least partly together, because, as we say, total separation is unattainable and is undesirable. Yet the only way that both can be free is based on collective equality. That's my argument. And unlike other places of conflict, in Israel-Palestine, the international system and international law support each group to fulfill its right to self-determination in independent state. So what is missing, as we know, is for Palestine to become a recognized sovereign state free from Israeli occupation. To accommodate the diversity and interdependency that exists and need to continue to exist, it is essential that the arrangements of the two states will be supported by different cross-border institutions for cooperation and, in a way, cross-border power sharing. Okay, that will be the guarantees for fair relations, fair system of cooperation. So what's now? Okay, this long-term view, how do I translate it to concrete policies at the moment? First of all, we need to have clearly stated the end game. We need to recognize that two states is the only way that we can settle this conflict, which means that Palestinian state, sovereign Palestinian state, along the 67 borders should be recognized. But we also need to acknowledge that separation is not the way to go to achieve the two-state solution, but rather partnership between the two states. And what we need to look now is how the transition can be made, and how do we establish security, proper security to all the people, mutual security to all of them, and how a Palestinian state, a viable Palestinian state, can be built or is built in the West Bank and Gaza. And Israelis need to acknowledge this is their interest, that their neighboring, most close neighboring state will be a successful and viable state. And what we need now, because we are found in this vicious circle of violence, and the fears are extremely high, especially after October 7th, the disbelief and the revenge and all those very hard and strong emotions. So we need an intense international involvement, both in diplomacy, but also in a form of international trusteeship. And we can learn from the experiences in other places, like in Bosnia and in East Timor, for inspiration, but we should do better, of course. So I'll end at the moment here, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Limor, for this really fascinating talk and this really enlightening ideas that you raised. One of the questions that Marcus Halside has raised asks if your approach really would fit a federal solution in Israel-Palestine. Is that where you're, and if not, where do you suggest, or how do you suggest that this partnership, how would it manifest?
Okay, so I'm not talking about a federal solution, but I'm talking about a sort of a confederal solution or a union. We can call it either a confederation, a union, or we do not need to call it. But the basic, and I think for me, the most important point is that we need to shift from thinking about separation, about how we move people, how we transfer people, how we build high walls as a basis for our peace. The opposite. What we need to look for is partnership. This is the main thing that we need to understand. I know at the moment it seems like the furthest as possible, but this is the right way to go. And this is what our efforts and our efforts needs to go, and our perceptions about what needs to happen. Because the idea of separation so far, what it entrenched is more animosity within the people. It's not built more trust, but the opposite of that. So to the question, I will say a confederal solution or a union like the EU. So we have two sovereign states, but we have intense, it depends, the intensity could vary depending on the choice of the sides, but we do need a strong cooperative based on equality.
And how do you suggest, because now a lot of the conversations really revolve around the lack of trust both communities share one to the other. And of course, recent events, October 7th on the Israeli side and the Gaza war currently have deteriorated the trust even more, and the feeling of entrenched hatred that could not be overcome. So how does collective equality approach that, and how is it able to regain trust, or and also what role does trust play in that framework?
So in a way, it first it builds on that, right? But actually, it builds it, because trust is not something we feel; it's actually something we do. And I think most of all, it's part of our how we act in the world. If you know, at the 7th of October, it's not that Israelis were afraid only of Palestinians that are living in the West Bank and Gaza. There were and Palestinians were not only afraid from Israelis. Arabs and Jews all around the country, also within Israel, were terrified. People were terrified to leave their homes. And the thing that managed and brought us back, and now we back in the universities, and I don't know how the people that hear us today understand. As I said, within Israel, we are 7 million, 8 million, 7 million Jews, and 2 million Arab Palestinians. So we live together also after the 7th of October. And we came back to live together gradually. But when we understand that this is the condition for our secure living, that we will be able to live together, that this is what needs to happen. So all our efforts go to that. And in a way, maybe I'm not explaining it concretely, but my belief, and I think reality shows us that trust is built on day-to-day interactions and long-term, and understanding that this is what will secure our future, and then we will invest in it.
And would you say that this is also what you learned from researching Bosnia or Ireland or the other areas that you have looked into?
Yeah. So in a way, I changed. So when I'm presenting the book and presenting the transitional process, before the 7th of October, I used more Northern Ireland process. And the Northern Ireland process, from transferring from a domination, Protestant domination, to collective equality, was a long one, since the early 70s until the 90s, and continues, right? It's a long process that relates to narrowing the gaps, the socioeconomic gaps, the cultural gaps, and building joint interactions within the workplace and in many other areas. That it's not absurd to have at the moment two women actually, that are the leaders. The Prime Minister of Northern Ireland today are two, right? It's not one, two, each representing one of the collectives. And when you do not know the other, when you only imagine how evil they are, it's not possible that you will be able to cooperate with them as a prime minister, right? We need long relationships and a lot of interactions. Some of them will be bad, but many of them can be can be good. And so long-lasting interactions and closing the gaps. That's my understanding. And I said it before the 7th of October, I used that process, and I think we still need it. But at the moment, because of the extreme of the crisis, and because we have a potential that the international community at the moment is interested, so I think I moved to the Bosnian example of the transition. And it means that we are talking about a long transition, but it can start more rapidly if you're looking into an international intervention, which needs to be a benevolent one and not a self-interested one.
Mm-hmm. And one of the question revolves around whenever a lot of us hear about power sharing, a lot of us tend to think about Lebanon and Lebanon as a maybe an example of a not so good implementation of power sharing, and especially the fact that the model, when it fell, kind of led to violence. What is your kind of...
Okay. So first of all, when we are comparing and what we're making critiques, we need to again recall what we are comparing to. Okay. So what are the alternatives that we have? And I skipped my analysis of majoritarian democracy or liberal democracy, right? The liberal democracy is actually what most of us think when we think about democracy, right? We do not think about power sharing democracy, but Lebanon is not the only place of power sharing. Actually, Switzerland is a power sharing democracy, and also Belgium, and at the moment, Northern Ireland and other places as well. And we have elements of that in different places. So having said that, liberal democracy, my analysis, when it's applied to deeply divided places, we do not come up with a very equal and benevolent place. What we come up with is a tyranny of the majority. And this is sometimes the places, as I said, that are the context for the eruption of ethnic conflicts and ethno-national conflict. So power sharing is not a magical word. It's not a magical model. That's why I built or I developed this model of collective equality. We do not need to take any model rigidly. It's not that. What we need to understand are the principles. The principles are that we need to have the major population groups around the central decision-making process, okay? And because majoritarian democracy is not a good guarantee for that in deeply divided places, power sharing, this is the idea of how the central government is shared by the major population groups. So we don't need to take it rigidly. And of course, there are many flaws. There are many problems, many challenges also in Bosnia and in Northern Ireland and in Belgium, and I'm sure also in Switzerland. And show me one liberal democracy that does not have flaws or problems.
Right. And you discussed earlier, Alan Cohen raised this question that you discussed that collective equality is really, as you said, not a replacement for individual equality, but rather an addition. And Alan is asking if you could really elaborate a little bit more how they fit together in one structure.
Okay, so in a way, and it's part of showing how the court in that case could done differently. First of all, it's about our ideas. How do we perceive those kinds of arrangements? Do we see them and look, okay, this is racial discrimination? Or do we look at them and say, well, this is legitimate. Now I need to balance between those two legitimate interests. The legitimate interest
to remind the court case for people who didn't remember.
Okay. So the court case was about two citizens of Bosnia that are not part of the major population groups that fought the war between each other. It's a Roma and a Jewish citizen origin, right? In origin of Bosnia. And they claim that they are discriminated against because they cannot run for the two top offices of Bosnia because they are not identifying themselves as one of those three groups, right? And okay, and then the court says, well, I don't see any legitimate aim here with these kinds of racial arrangements. And my argument is it's not that the right of the collective needs to trump, to overcome the individual one, yeah, but it's like, let's take it like the right to strike, right? If we were not, maybe I'm confusing there, but I'm trying that, okay? Because sometimes it's hard to understand how the two are connected or being balanced. So if we didn't have the right to strike and a group were going on strike, then it was clear there is nothing against the owner of this company saying, well, you are violating my right to property or whatever, right? But when you have a right to strike, suddenly you have something that you are balancing with. It's not meaning that the right to property is not any more relevant. It just means that you have two things that need to be balanced and we need to wait. And it depends on the concrete situation. Maybe we have alternatives and so forth. But the major thing that I wanted to make here is that we can look at those arrangements not as illegitimate, but as legitimate, as pursuing a legitimate aim. And once we did that, we can balance with individual rights. And I hope I answered that.
I think you did. You touched upon this a little bit earlier, but I thought it was very interesting. And Janet Halbert was mentioning that there is a tremendous economic imbalance between the group. And how would you see overcoming the economic conditions for these two states to exist, and maybe the framework of cooperation, and how would that?
Yeah. So first of all, when we have our conception of justice right, we suddenly see what's lacking, right? And I think that's the most important thing, because we see what's lacking and what needs to be changed. And so in a way, now we want to compare how we view peace under this framework of collective equality and how we view peace just a minute ago when we talked about separation, right? When we're talking about separation, inequalities are not relevant because we are imaginally are behind high walls, right? Irrespective of each other. As we said, it's not possible. Now, when we're saying, okay, we need to cooperate, it's true that the inequalities rise up. And economic inequality is a big problem, of course, and this is part of the transition that needs to take place. So part of the policies that when we think about peace, part of the policies of peacemaking in Israel-Palestine need to target this extreme gap, the extreme economic gap between Palestinians and Israelis. So it's an answer for this is the policy that needs to be pursued, and it can be pursued. It will take time. It's not something. So collective equality is not offering a magical cure that can be done tomorrow. It needs to start tomorrow, and it will take time. It will take even a long time. But once we know that we are gradually going there, I think we can be on the right direction. And I think any promises for magical cures are misleading and are actually not helpful.
So for you, it's really just the recognition that this is something that needs to be taken as part of the process, that the both need to think about, maybe through industries, through policies, or for
yes,
definitely.
Yes, to direct the policies that are. So first of all, to look at Israel. Okay, one more thing. We are used to analyzing Israel and Palestine separately. We're talking about when we are analyzing Israeli democracy, we're analyzing it like it exists within the 67 borders. Israel do not exist within the 67 borders. Israel is all over the place, right? It controls the entire territory, and therefore any analysis of existing Israel, contemporary Israel, cannot be done without looking at the entire space between the river and the sea. And so this is one thing that we need to look at. And then when we are looking at that, when we're talking about, okay, we now need to shift from domination, and this domination has its different phases in economic, in culture, right, in recognition, and in political power. All of them are, as I recall, are parts of the idea of collective equality. And this is also from the literature of power sharing. Indeed, this is something that we need to close the gaps with. And as I said, it's a long process, but we need to be directed towards that.
And if you raised by yourself the idea of domination, can you elaborate a bit more of what you see as these relations of dominations? Why is that so crucial for defining collective equality, for understanding collective equality?
So it's crucial because it depends. So equality has a lot of meanings, right? It's a very like justice, and we need to understand what the type, when we say something, what do we mean by that, right? So on the one hand, I said, okay, I'm talking about equality in all those senses. I'm talking about distributive justice, and I'm talking about representative justice, right? Political representation. I'm talking about a cultural recognition. So in one hand, I'm talking about everything, following Nancy Fraser typology, right? But on the other hand, I'm focusing that all those are tools, that what we need to look at are the kinds of relations that we have between the sides. And when I'm saying that, and when I'm focusing on domination or on the relations, what I'm saying is that we don't need to check, okay, I have $5 million and so do you. It's not about formal equality. It's not about that. It's about the kind of relations that need to be established. And of course, how do we measure that depends on the intensity of the cooperation. If we are two groups in the same state, okay, in the same small state, so we will have more kind of those formal equalities in place. But when we are two states, it could be more diverse. But still, so it needs to be a justice. Our ideas of power sharing, as they are used as part of internal models of governance, can be qualified for when we're talking about an international power sharing mechanism, like I'm imagining for Israel-Palestine. And then we can learn from the European Union. Again, when we're learning from an example, we need to take what's working and what's not working and learn from both of them.
Okay, yeah. And this is more of a theoretical question, but I think that that you definitely deal with that in the book. So Cynthia Saltzman is asking, how does your account compares to other group rights theories such as Will Kimlicka, Charles Taylor, Michael Walzer, and others?
Yeah, so first of all, I definitely build on them and I relate to them in the book. I think with regard to multiculturalism and minority rights, first of all, I include both minorities and majorities in the picture. And I think majorities are lacking from most of the, definitely from multicultural or minority rights that are focusing only on the deprived groups. But as we understand conflicts, also the majority is feeling threatened. And I think we need to acknowledge also the position of the majority in such situations and its strive for recognition as well. Coming from Israel, there is definitely a strive for recognition that Israel and that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in Israel, in the land of Israel, right? So this is one element. Another element is that I bring in the idea of reciprocity, which I think is lacking from the ideas of minority rights. And here I combine a fundamental element of justice and fairness from Rawls, which looks at reciprocity as something that is crucial for liberal conceptions of justice. And I bring it into the idea of group rights. And I think it's crucial because conflict is about misused. I don't have the word now. The opposite of good relations, right? Bad relations between the groups. Yeah.
And the reciprocity is how does that tangibly work into your?
So reciprocity, it means that I'm, again, in all the idea of a fair system of cooperation, of looking into the relations as the idea of equality, that equality is a relational equality, that is non-domination, that is created within the relations. This is how I bring in the reciprocity. I look in a way, I look for the engagement between the groups. I look into the idea of parity of esteem, if I take it from the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement. So parity of esteem is one of the ideas that grew in the Northern Ireland peace process, meaning that I relate to the other as I relate to my own account, my own narrative. I acknowledge that the other also has a right to hold his narrative, and I need to accept it. Okay, so it's echoing both the pragmatic experience of the Northern Ireland peace process, of looking at the other and accepting it, accepting its narrative, its cultural heritage, respecting it and respecting the other, and also based on Rawls' ideas of justice. So I combine here both theoretical understandings and what I see on the ground in places that are with good practice, I would say, or better.
And speaking of things on the ground, of examples, sorry, on the ground, another question that we have is why couldn't the Oslo peace process lead really towards the point you mentioned as collective equality, such as trade, mutual respect, fair distribution of water, and so forth? Why was this not part of the negotiation? And I know you know quite a lot about that. You just wrote about it too, so it'll be interesting to.
Yeah. So it's not that Oslo couldn't bring about fair cooperation. Because Oslo was based on the idea of separation, and not only in the slogan, but also in practice. Since the beginning of the 90s, in Israel-Palestine, since 67, since Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, the borders were open. So Palestinians could move in Israel, Israelis could move in the West Bank and Gaza. Movement was free. I know that now it sounds imaginable, but at the time, that's how it was. Palestinians drove and worked, and the same Israelis went to Gaza and did shopping and went to the beach. I never did that, but many others did. And the separation started after the peace process started, and it was not because of violence. So the first Intifada started in 87, but the separation started later, not because of that, but because we changed our view of the future here, of the political horizon. And since the political horizon understood that we are talking into separation, and when the ideas are ideas of separation, then the hostility towards the other just increases. So in a way, that's my assumption, that it increases and not made cooperation more favorable. It lessened it. And two more points are that when we are talking about the idea, so part of the Oslo process and the assumptions of the peace process until now regards to the settlements, right? The settlements are, of course, a project that is and still ongoing, and is a clear violation of international law. Yet, I showed you the facts. The facts are that hundreds of thousands of people, some of them live there for decades and see these places as their own, as their home, and live there. And The idea beneath Oslo was that we cannot, even if we have some rerouting of the borders, even if we include the major settlement blocks, we will remain. And an up-to-date estimation is that we're talking about more than 100,000 Israelis that needs to be evacuated. So if this is the assumption, then that was the assumption of Oslo, that we cannot. And you can look also on the interim arrangements, right? What they reflect is total mistrust with the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not allowed to so Israelis are not to be tried before Palestinian courts. Just one example of how the trust and mistrust is being reflected from those arrangements, right? So this is the message that the process leads to. So if we are to evacuate all Jews from Palestine, because, and what are the because is? Because we are not trusting the Palestinians, because they will kill them, right? Or because we do not trust the settlers. There are different justifications for that. And so in a way, that's how I see that the idea of separation is going and against against promoting peace and not in favor of that. And it's not that because Oslo per se is not in favor of cooperation, but the whole spirit is against it. And when we're assuming that Jews cannot live in Palestine, when we are assuming that separation is the idea, then we're jeopardizing, we're suddenly opening a question over the status of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. And then we come up with ideas like Avigdor Lieberman's plan of transferring of populated areas, right? So it's a bad way to go. We need to change the way. That's the major element of my analysis.
And just to kind of understand this more, what you discussed that it is a bad way to go, but can you explain to us from historical examples what's really at stake when we're talking about population swaps or such ideas?
What do you mean? What Avigdor Lieberman actually means about it? So he looks
No.
at, or what?
Oh, okay.
Oh,
I mean, well, you could also explain what he means by that, but why is that so detrimental? Why are population swaps so detrimental if we're talking about moving towards some kind of agreements? Even you showed us the example in Greece where that was agreed upon. Nonetheless, it had traumatic consequences. So if you can kind of elaborate more about that.
Yeah. So as I said, at the beginning of the 20th century, population transfers were part of the policy. And it was practiced also after the Second World War. But if we are now in the age, so first of all, and it could be, and it's arguable whether they succeeded, right? Whether the success, the peaceful time after the World War depends on those population transfers. I would question that. But even if so one way is to achieve peace by causing traumatic effects to hundreds of thousands of people. I would argue that in our context, it will cause, beyond the fact that it seems to me as impossible politically, even if it was possible, I would say that it will bring about not peace, but more violence. And I think partitions, we saw how partitions that had the idea of separation looked like, both in Israel, Palestine, in Cyprus as well, but in India, Pakistan, and so forth. So it's a really risky moment. And I am aware of that. Partition is a risky moment, and therefore this is why we need to accompany that with some kind of an umbrella guarantees that it will gradually be being built into a sustainable situation. And I want to go back to the concrete question of why do I see it so dramatic? So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that against their will are going to be uprooted from their houses. Okay, so if we are in favor of human rights, if we really respect people and are concerned about their well-being, and we are against domination and coercion, so I don't think it is in line with coercing people to leave their homes when they perceive that home to be as part of their homeland, right? So both Jews and Palestinians look on the entire territory between the river and the sea as a homeland. And I think we can, under our new understanding of how peace should look between Israelis, between Jews and Palestinians, we need to also acknowledge that both of them look at this territory as a homeland. And although we divide it into two states, it doesn't mean that we cannot acknowledge that they see it as a homeland. And therefore, they can live in Hebron, even if you're Jew and even if you are Arab. And it's not undermining the our commitment to keep on political stability. Okay, so political stability, of course, is crucial, and this is the basis both for peace but also for justice, right? If we have violent conflict, any kind of justice cannot be achieved, right? But gradually and with an umbrella or some kind of a regime that supports the security and stability of the situation, we can gradually proceed into something that we can live side by side. And as I said, in Israel, we live side by side. In Jerusalem, we live side by side, really in great intermingling. So it's not something that we do not experience here. We just need to expand it, and we need to expand it to the entire territory, that Jews and Palestinians can live side by side, not only in Jaffa and in Haifa and in Akko and in Jerusalem, but also in Hebron and in Nablus and in Gaza. At the moment, Gaza is, as I said, mono-ethnic, but in the future, when the Free State of Palestine will be there in Gaza and the West Bank, maybe also Jews can live there. So it's, at the moment, it seems unconceivable. Not and when I say Jews can live there, it's not that I'm saying, okay, we need now to settle, to build new settlements, right? This is the opposite of what I'm saying. What I'm saying.
But are you suggesting a one state solution, or what exact? So.
No, what I'm offering are two states. But if we look at, for example, France and Germany, Germans can live in France and French can live in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. Okay, we have our sovereign state, but the borders can be porous. They don't need to be built with concrete. And I'm well aware of the security concerns. I live here near the border. Okay, I totally am aware of the security concerns, and they need to be acknowledged, and we need to move forward gradually, but we need to have really clear agenda of what do we want to build. Do we want to build walls built from concrete, or do we want to build good relations? I choose the second.
Oh, that's a great way for us to end this talk, with a positive note, and thank you for this really invigorating conversation, and your invigorating ideas and thoughts, and moving us forward in these very troubling times, and of a lot of fears and insecurity. So it's great to have fresh ideas and a new path forward. I want to thank all our participants and our audience for your amazing and wonderful questions, and I wish you all a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tamar. Bye.